Well, let me address briefly first this question of slavery.
All right, let's see it.
When we hear the word slavery, Ben, we think of slavery as it existed in the American South.
Well, doesn't this sound familiar?
And as you know, that is nothing like the system that existed in ancient Israel.
So this is flatly wrong on a couple of counts. To begin, there was not one consistent system. At least the Bible does not represent one single consistent system. At the very least, it represents two, but there's variation within each of them. And those two are the chattel slavery for non-Israelites and indentured servitude or debt slavery for native Israelites. And like I said, there's variation within these. For instance, whether you are a male selling yourself as an indentured servant or whether you are a female who is being sold by her father into slavery. If the latter, you don't get released after 7 years. You are a permanent slave. And as far as chattel slavery goes, there absolutely was chattel slavery. It is absolutely endorsed explicitly in Leviticus 25:44 through 46. And while it is not race-based, because the concept of racial categories didn't develop until medieval Europe, so it can't possibly have been race-based, it is still very much chattel slavery, which Craig is going to entirely ignore throughout the remainder of this video.
In ancient Israel, there was no social safety net sponsored by the state. There was no poverty program. So if a man got himself into a situation where he couldn't pay his debts, he could keep his family together and retain his self-respect by selling himself as an indentured servant to his creditor until he could work off his debts, and then he would have to be set free. After 7 years, he had to be set free in any case.
So this is more or less accurate, but Craig is kind of massaging the text of the Bible to make it sound a lot more benevolent than it actually is. For instance, if a man does sell himself into slavery and then while the slave marries someone, has children, when he gets released, whether for paying off the debt or after the 7 years, they don't come with him. They remain the slaves of his master. Additionally, as I mentioned earlier, if a man sells his daughter into slavery in order to pay off debts, she doesn't get released, period. Not after 7 years, not after paying off debts. She's a slave in perpetuity. The system is not entirely consistent internally because we're looking at a handful of different texts written by different authors in different time periods, and largely they are trying to recreate a past that didn't really exist, and so they do it inconsistently. So we can't really recreate one single unified system of slavery from the biblical text, and attempts to do so are primarily aimed at apologetic purposes like what Craig is doing here.
So this was really a form of indentured servanthood. It wasn't slavery as we think of that term.
So if we were isolating and exclusively addressing indentured servitude, debt slavery, I would agree that it is not the same as the imagery that we conjure up in our minds when we hear about slavery. But nobody ever specified indentured servitude. We talked about slavery more broadly, and chattel slavery is what we tend to think of, and that is absolutely and explicitly endorsed in the Hebrew Bible. And Craig here has artfully dodged even acknowledging it, much less confronting that fact.
This was actually an anti-poverty program. And in some respects, I think it's better than what we have in modern Western culture, which destroys families, ruins people's self-respect because they're not working. Whereas in ancient Israel, a man retained his self-respect. He worked for an income. He paid his debts. He kept his family together. And that, to call that slavery is just a gross misrepresentation.
So I would suggest that one's right-wing authoritarian identity politics have really jumped the shark if they compel them to actually make the argument that debt slavery would be a better solution to poverty than just adequately taxing the wealthy.